Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another of our regular Wednesday morning lectures here at Hess Park that provided by the Peninsula Seniors. We're happy to have you all here, and I'm delighted and honored to present our speaker, Colonel Ralph Wetterhahn, U.S. Air Force retired, a veteran of 180 combat missions in Vietnam, and credited with a MiG-21 kill. And as you can imagine, we're going to be talking about aircraft. And so, without any further delay, please help me welcome Colonel Ralph Wetterhahn.
Well, thank you, Marty. And I want to thank Gerald and Betty, and particularly the group in front of me here, the seniors, for inviting me to speak with you this morning. As you can look to your right, you'll see a photograph of a helicopter. That's a Mi-2, Mi-2 Soviet-era helicopter, and it's probably one of the better ones I've ridden in during some of these adventures. But I'm always asked the question about why I allow myself to get in these machines and go to some of these god-awful places in search of the things that I'm after. And in order to answer that question, I've got to take you back to October 7th, 1966. I was stationed at Ubon Air Base in Thailand, and that day I had flown a day mission up over Hanoi, a long 3-hour mission requiring fuel. And I came back and I was quite tired and sweaty and all that, and I was heading over towards the club where we would eat, and I ran into an old friend of mine, a lieutenant by the name of Robert Gilchrist. We called him Gilly. And Gilly and I had trained together at George Air Force Base in California. And while we were there, I met his girlfriend, attractive young woman, and they invited me to go with them downtown to watch a movie. And the movie happened to be The Blue Max, which many of you may have seen with George Papard. It's a World War I movie about German pilots who have to amass 20 aerial kills before they're awarded this Blue Max medal. Well, we watched that movie, and that was pretty heady stuff for a couple lieutenants who were getting ready to go to Asia to test their skills against the MiG aircraft. But anyway, I met Gilly on the path going to the club, and he was in the night flying squadron. I was in the day squadron. So we went into the club, sat down together. He ordered breakfast, I ordered dinner, and we sat there and talked. Now, he mentioned that he'd gotten engaged to that young lady and that they were planning to get married, and he was going to fly his 98th mission that night. He would have 2 more after that. He already had his airline tickets back to the States where he was going to get married. They were going to honeymoon in Honolulu, Hawaii. And then he had his assignment to fly F-4 Phantoms over in Germany. So he did most of the talking, and I was quite envious because he had 98 missions, I had about 15, and I was a long ways from being finished. But I listened, and then we finished dinner, and he went off to his briefing, and I went into the little club we had there and had a beer or two to kind of unwind. And then I headed back to my hooch. And about the time I crawled between the sheets, that's when Gilly's airplane went missing. So for Gilly, there was no wedding. That hotel room in Honolulu was empty that next week. He never got the assignment to Germany, never had any kids, grandkids, promotions, disappointments, all the things that make up what we consider a full measure of living. And that's pretty much what drives me now. Because, for example, let me ask this crowd, how many of you were at least teenagers during the period of World War II? Raise your hand. At least teenagers. Yeah, see, just about all the hands are going up. Okay? In World War II, 480,000 American servicemen and women gave their lives during that conflict. if they were, some of them in this room tonight, and the rest of them spread out around the country and around the world, they would have enjoyed 30 million years of living and loving and having kids and all of the things that everyone in this room, including myself, have been able to enjoy over those many years. 30 million years, but they never got to live those years. And for some of them, they went off to that conflict and just simply disappeared from the face of the earth. They died in cold, lonely places, in miserable conditions, and some of them at those last few moments probably wondered if anyone would ever find out the circumstances surrounding their death. And so that's my focus. It's on death in obscurity, those men and women who never really had a chance to tell their loved ones what happened and the things they accomplished during that conflict and the conflicts subsequent to that. So that's why I do it. And the first one we want to talk about involves a place called Kamchatka, which is in the Russian Far East. It's a big peninsula that juts down out of Siberia, and it looks a little bit like Florida, but it's about 3 times as long. Word came in through the U.S. Embassy after the collapse of the Soviet Union that a KGB document identified an aircraft having been found in 1962 on the site of an extinct volcano. Didn't describe anything about the aircraft, but that it was possibly an American aircraft. Now, we gave a lot of planes to the Russians during that war under the Lend-Lease program, so we didn't quite know what to expect. But I got a magazine assignment and flew out of Anchorage, Alaska, after checking on all of the lost data that they had there at the history office in Elmendorf Air Force Base. I flew to Petropavlovsk in Kamchatka and then rode on this helicopter out to the side of the volcano. Now this is in August, and you can see behind the helicopter there's a bit of snow there. It's a pretty cold, desolate place, and there's a very narrow window of weather when you can get into sites like this. So we landed there, and this is the crash site, and you can see from the slide that there's not a whole lot there. It's pretty torn up, but it can be rather amazing what you can find out from small bits of information that turn up with each and every piece, because they all have a story to tell. So I walked the crash site, and initially I thought, aircraft hits hill, blows up, all men are killed, that kind of thing is what you assume. But it's usually not a good idea to assume too much, because you might find that you're quite wrong. And one of the things that I discovered after looking was the tail, and that's the tail, and there's 2 tails like on a B-25 bomber, but we still didn't quite know what we were dealing with. But you notice the number 31 on there. And that's typically the way the U.S. Navy marks their aircraft. Each squadron airplane has a big number on the side, sometimes from 1 to 15, from 15 to 30, whatever it might be. And in this case, the squadron had put 31 on that particular aircraft. Okay, so we found the bureau number, the Navy bureau number, which was also on the tail. And so I checked my data and discovered that it was a Navy PV-1 Ventura, a twin-engined medium bomber that our Navy flew during the war. Okay, the next thing I discovered was that at the bottom of this, not the bottom, but lower on the side of the volcano were both engines. And well up in the background where you see those 2 individuals standing, that's where the main wreckage was found. But here we have some rather interesting things to look at from the standpoint of any of you that were pilots or know engineering and whatnot, is those propellers. And they tell a message, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me give you an example of how you can start looking at things. Now, a propeller has a shaft, and so it's a bit like this Coca-Cola can that I have in my hand. Now, if you think of the letter Z, like Zorro, the sign of Zorro, I'm going to do something with this can. to damage it. Now I could push it together, and it would crush. I could pull it apart, and it would start to look a little bit like taffy. I can try to shear left and right like this, and it would have a different effect. Or I can try to put torque on it. Now torque is twisting motion in opposite directions. And that's what I'm going to do now. And we'll see what happens when I torque this. Okay, do you see that line right here? It happens to be exactly 45 degrees from these two axes. It is always 45 degrees when you have torque damage. So anytime you look at a piece of metal like a propeller and you see something like this, then you can suspect that maybe the problem was over torquing of the propeller and then it sheared. But there are many other things that propellers and the airframe will tell us. And what we're looking at here is these propellers are saying an awful lot. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what they're saying because some of you are pretty good about aviation stuff. And if you happen to take a peek at my book and go through it, it's sort of like a detective mystery, and some of you will figure it out just like I have, and maybe you'll figure a little more out and get back to me with some additional information that'll help me later on. But there's a big message here, because if engines are damaged, running roughly, the pilot might feather the prop. In other words, he might turn them into the slipstream so he can maintain higher air speeds. When an engine hits something solid, sometimes the props shear off because of all the energy that's displaced. There's all kinds of things that happen, but we're looking here and it doesn't look like too much is going on, does it? To either one of those. So here's another shot of those props. And again, you'll notice the lack of damage. And there's a little bending there, so something happened, but we're not quite sure what. Okay, so I go back and now I want to try to figure out what is a PV-1 Navy Ventura doing on the side of a volcano in the old Soviet Union, Kamchatka Peninsula, sometime during World War II. So I go to the archives in Washington, D.C. to start looking into a little bit of this, and I come across this photograph. And I was hoping to find one of the particular aircraft I was interested in other words, Bomber 31 with that bureau number. But that's a very tough thing to do, because how do you find just one airplane? And I came across this photograph. Now you notice on the one that's closest to us, the big number 28. Well, it turns out that aircraft crashed the same night in March of 1944 that Bomber 31 went down. But Bomber 28 crashed right after takeoff in icing conditions out of a small island in the Aleutians called Attu. And then I looked at the other aircraft and I wondered what was going on with that other aircraft, but I couldn't see the tail number on that. But just beneath the wings is an external fuel tank. And I looked, and there was number 31 hidden. I let out a whoop in this you have white gloves on and they do a body search on you before you get in there. I let out this whoop, and the archivist looked at me and with this sort of scolding look, and then realized, yeah, this happens all the time, just keep it down, and I went on. I had found Bomber 31, and it had launched from Attu, 1,500 miles out on the Aleutian island chain. And not only did it launch from there, but it flew 750 miles across the Bering Sea and the North Pacific to the northern Kuril Islands, these two small islands right here, Shimushu and Paramashiru, to conduct a bombing mission against the Japanese forces located there. But how does it go from Attu to here and wind up here? That was the question, and that's the thing I had to resolve. On the particular mission that we're talking about, the night of that mission, there were two combat missions that they were going to allow aerographers to fly on. Now, an aerographer is a Navy weatherman who briefs the crews on the weather. And they liked for these men to fly one of the missions so they could see all of the frontals and all of the kinds of things that they experienced up there at Attu in the Aleutians, and so they'd be better equipped to talk about it. So there was one mission that was just going to be a patrol mission about the island, and then there was a second one that was going to be a bombing mission, as we mentioned. The two aerographers, one of them was Jack Parlier, pictured here. They flipped a nickel to see who would get the combat mission, and Parlier won the toss, and he wanted to go on the combat mission. It would be his first flight in an airplane. It would be his first combat mission, and ultimately it was the last of those missions. When we got to Kamchatka and went out to the wreck site, I looked down at a stringer, lower cockpit stringer, while we were investigating things, and there, sitting on the edge, if you notice, is a Jefferson nickel right there. Can you see it? Right here. Right about in this position here, where you just see another part of the metal, there was a human phalanx bone, which is the finger bone. We removed it because we don't like to photograph remains. And it was pointing right at that nickel. We picked up the nickel, turned it over, and it was dated 1943. It would have been kind of strange if it had been dated after 1944, but it was the right date. That nickel was subsequently returned to Parlier's sister after the completion of the mission by the Joint Task Force people, the recovery folks that work out of Hawaii. And by the way, that's who I was with on this particular expedition. I was traveling as a journalist just to record what the people, the military folks do in recovering remains of our veterans. Okay, here's Dr. Ann Bunch. She's the anthropologist, and they go along on these missions to recover the remains, and this is what I call the moment of discovery. She's looking inside the wreckage, and she has just identified some vertebrae bones that are there on the surface, and she's going to collect them and take them back to Hawaii, where they will undergo the DNA testing to identify the remains of those pilots. Now, one of the questions that we have was, did anyone survive this crash? And I guess you'd have to back up and say, did the airplane impact in a manner which would allow survival? And that could be determined. Again, I leave it up to you to see whether my analysis holds water. But I determined that they could have survived, and the report the Russians submitted indicated that remains were found outside of the wreckage area. So that also was an indication that some of the folks at least made it clear. There was no fire, by the way, no signs of fire on any of the wreckage that we examined. Okay, next slide. Okay, but one of the things that helps, like I say, identify what happened or indicate what happened, this is a 50 caliber round. This is pretty much a new one, and this is how they look after they come out of the factory, and they have a belt, and there'll be a round next to it on either side that goes through a machine gun if that's what it's going to be fired from. But you can see it's pretty long, and it's got a, this is a ball ammo on the top. But that's what it tends to look like when it's new. Now, when I went from the crash site back up the ridge line that was about 200 yards from the actual wreckage, I got very, very lucky. I stumbled upon a pile of 50 caliber shell casings, and this is one of those that I brought back from that site that was deposited there some 60 odd years ago. Now, what's interesting about this is if you look at the back where the primer is, it's not been struck, and yet the bullet's missing. What they had done after the crash was they had taken one of the machine gun belts and they had stripped only the tracer ammunition of the rounds. They have high explosive incendiary and armor piercing, and then you have a tracer round. They had stripped every fourth round off of this belt. They had carried it to where I'm standing, and that's our campsite down below on that lake. And you could see about 20 miles to the north and about 25 miles to the south, and they had piled these tracer rounds and set them on fire, hoping that the round would shoot up in the air like a Roman candle. Now, it won't go as far because it's not in a barrel, but it'll go a couple of 100 feet, and it'll burn. It'll have a little red tracer mark. And they were hoping that someone would see that signal and come rescue them. So this little round told us so much, and you can tell by the neck and the way the neck has been damaged that this round was not in a barrel when it actually fired. And of course, the lack of having the primer hit was also indication. So that's one of the things that you learn just by finding a small item 200 yards away from the wreck site. So that convinced me that they had survived. Now, none of them came out of it. They all disappeared into obscurity. But in the end, the Joint Task Force identified the remains of at least 3 of those men. They found a boot from the 4th man. And we suspect that 2 or 3 of them probably tried to walk out. But it was in March, the dead of winter in that area, 9 feet of snow. And it was a good 25 miles from the nearest place where there would be any human, inhabitants. And they didn't make it. They simply didn't make it. This is a slide of those 2 islands that we were attacking. Now, how important was all of this that's going on up there in the Aleutians? Well, it was darn important, because the Doolittle Raiders had bombed Tokyo back in 1942, and the Japanese thought the bombers came from the Aleutian Islands. That's why they later on attacked and captured Attu and Kiska. So these islands were heavily fortified, and there was a lot of Japanese aircraft and troops up on these islands because there was the thought that they were going to be invaded from the north. It took a lot of pressure off of MacArthur's forces coming up through the South Pacific, in that an awful lot of stuff was up here. And all it took was this bombing campaign from a Navy and Army Air Force bomber squadrons situated out on the end of that Aleutian chain, bombing every night and sometimes during the day, starting in late 1943 and all through 44 and into 45. So it had a tremendous impact, but it's one of those things that just sort of was a sideshow in World War II and very few people have ever heard about. Okay, I got to go down to these islands on an Mi-6 helicopter later on. I was one of the first Americans to set foot. These are still controlled by the Soviet or Russians now. The Japanese don't get on these islands, and we were probably the first Americans to set foot on those islands in God knows how long, probably 100 years. But this is one of the places where there was a fishing village, and on the left you can see some brown items there. Those are the landing craft that are still sitting there from World War II that the Russians used when they invaded these islands. The ramps are still down, and they just sit there rusting away. The entire town is totally deserted. There was not a human being in sight. It was just this eerie feeling that history had just sort of stopped right then and there and never went on. But we were looking for remains of pilots that had been shot down over the island. We were unsuccessful in that endeavor, but I found it quite interesting. Now, one of the things that also turned up during this examination of what was going on all of these islands was that Truman Fucano. Now, Truman Fucano grew up in San Diego. His mother and father were Japanese citizens. They'd come over here, they started a fishing business down there, was very successful. He grew up like everyone else in that area, playing baseball and football and going to high school, like eating hot dogs and hamburgers. And then his father died, and about 3 months later, his mother died, so there were these kids, his brothers and sisters. They called back to Japan and said, "What should we do?" And they said, "Come home." He told me, he said, "I went back to Tokyo, and it was 1941. He said, "I didn't speak the language, The food was strange to me, and I wound up in the wrong Navy. Now, his uncle tried to protect him. They put him in the reserves. But that didn't last long because eventually all the reserves got called up, and he got sent to Shimusu, the northernmost of those 2 islands I showed you, where he was stationed. And one of his jobs, because he spoke English, was to talk to the POWs, that, the bomber pilots that were shot down. And they would come in and they would be interrogated and they'd get roughed up a little bit. And then after that, he'd shoo off all of the bad guys and he'd tell these flyers, hey, I'm in the same problem you've got. And he'd go through this whole story. Of course, they didn't buy any of it. They thought, he's just trying to get intelligence information out of them. But he would sneak them food and he would protect them from severe beatings and that sort of thing. And he really got their trust to the extent that after World War II, one of these captives found out about his situation and communicated with him, and they're very close friends to this day. But he fought through that bombing campaign on that island, at the end of which, when the Russians came in, they surrendered. They got loaded aboard ships. All he took was a small blanket, and his day uniform, and got aboard this ship thinking they're going to go back to Tokyo. But instead of heading south, they headed north to Magadan, a town on the coast in Siberia. And then he went up to one of the camps in the most brutal of the Soviet Gulag system, the Kolyma region, where life expectancy was 1 winter. He made it through 4. He came out of there weighing about 80 pounds. So here's a kid who grows up as an American, winds up tossed around by history, and gets on that island and then spends 4 years in a Soviet gulag and survives it all. It is one incredible story, but it's one of the many that I come across when you get into these things, and I find them fascinating. Okay, so that was Kamchatka, and that was World War II. But now we're going to talk about the first time that I got involved in this process that I undertake, and that happened back in 1995. I was writing this novel, and I needed to learn about forensics. So I contacted the Joint Task Force out there in Hawaii to see if I could go with them on one of these expeditions where they go out looking for human remains. And they agreed to let me do that. So I flew to Bangkok, and when I got there, the public affairs officer greeted me, Lieutenant Colonel King, and he said, look, I've got some bad news for you. He said, President Bush, now that's the senior president, he was out of office at that time, is on a information gathering trip to Vietnam. He's taken our seats on the helicopter, we're not going. I just traveled 6,000 miles and we're not going. He says, I couldn't tell you because his itinerary is classified until, they finally release it. They released it this morning, and now I can tell you. He says, but I'll make it up to you if you like. Next month we're going to Cambodia, and we're going to look for remains of American Air Force, Marine, and Navy servicemen who went missing during the Mayaguez incident. Well, I headed back home, and I looked into what he was talking about and discovered that right at the end of the Vietnam War, the SS Mayaguez, which was a U.S. registered container ship, was hijacked off the Cambodian coast. Now, it was traveling from Hong Kong around Vietnam and was on its way up to Sahib. Now, this was May 12th of 1975. Now, if you remember your history, Cambodia fell on April 15th, and South Vietnam fell on April 30th. So the Vietnam War had just ended. Now, 12 days later, here we go. We're traveling on our way to Sahib with goods for the BXs and whatnot, the American servicemen. It was hijacked near Polowai Island, and then the ship went and was anchored on an island called Gauteng. Aboard were some 41 merchant mariners. and it created an international incident. President Ford was in office at the time, and he decided we just can't let that happen, and he ordered a military retaliation, and it was quite effective. They tried to find out exactly where the ship was and what was going on with the crew, and as Henry Kissinger remarked later on, every single important piece of intelligence information was completely wrong. And yet somehow President Ford still made the right decisions with one exception. And that one exception was he approved the attack on this small island called Gonca. Now, because of the information that he had gotten, he thought the crew of the Mayaguez was on the island, because the Mayaguez was anchored right here, just off the northern tip. He thought the crew was located on this beach here in a military compound. Now there's an east beach and there's another beach over here on the west called the West Beach. And the assault was designed to hit those beaches at sunrise and overrun the camp and rescue the crew. That was the basic plan. Unfortunately, the crew wasn't there. They were on another island, and they were released that morning by the Cambodian government in response to the military attacks that Ford had authorized the day prior. So we didn't need to go there, is the point. But we went. It was a brutal battle. The first two helicopters that assaulted the East Beach were immediately shot down. The two helicopters that assaulted the West Beach, the first one was shot up so badly it crashed a mile off the beach. The second one made it back to the mainland and crash landed on the mainland. So 4 out of 4 went down. And it continued that way. It was every bit as violent and brutal as Omaha Beach, only in microcosm. It was very concentrated. People were getting shot up in these helicopters. You can see this here. This is blood coloring the water red that the pilots noticed when they flew over from all of the dead and wounded that were aboard that one helicopter. This is a rotor head, and I dove out off the coast there to see what kind of wreckage was there. This is the rotor head from one of the helicopters. It's a massive piece of equipment sitting there, and it's still there to this day. This is the Mayaguez, which was assaulted by the USS Holt, and the Marines went over the side for the first time in over 150 years or so, and recaptured that ship without a fight. But of course there were no crew members on it. They were brought back after they were released by the Cambodians, put aboard ship, and it sailed away. But while that's going on, the men that were on these two helicopters are trying to survive. Some of them swam seaward towards the Navy ship that was out off the coast. And as they swam, they shed their equipment, their bulletproof vests, their helmets, everything that had any weight, because it was a long swim and they were going to be out there a while. Now I dove, as I mentioned, with snorkel gear out off the coast, and this is a piece of Kevlar that you see here. Now on the vest it goes right about here, and there'll be 2 of them here, and then there's a bunch of them across the back. And they will protect you from shrapnel. They will not stop one of these. They will not stop one of these. So this one, the owner of this probably survived, although some were killed trying to swim out. Most of them made it out. Now in this particular slide, you see this individual right here. He's been blinded by the flames in the helicopter. He can't see. And he's just swimming where people are telling him to swim, and now he's approaching the ship, and they've thrown him a life ring, and he's trying to grab for it. And while you can't hear the noise of battle while you look at this slide, let me tell you, it was going on big time. They were shooting RPGs, 50 caliber machine guns, and all manner of things while they're trying to rescue these men. 3 of the Marines got off the helicopter and charged the beach like Marines are trained to do. They were all cut down. Later on, in the sand, buried near a tree, I found this piece of Kevlar. There's a pretty good chance that this belonged to one of those Marines that didn't survive. but we'll never know, just like we'll never know for sure about this one either. But some things we do know, or we can at least claim we know. And here's another 50 caliber. Okay, I'm going to take it apart. This is the shell casing, just like I showed you earlier. If you look at the primer, it's been hit, meaning this round had been fired. Because this fits in so nicely, I can tell you that it was inside the barrel of a machine gun when it fired. The Marines and the Navy didn't have any 50 calibers. So I know that this was fired by a Khmer Rouge, but I don't know who it was fired at. Could have been fired at an aircraft, could have been fired at one of these men. We'll never know, but we know that it was Khmer Rouge and it was fired at one of our guys. This bullet, however, is a little different. This one I found buried in what's called the berm around a machine gun position on the west or southern flank of the Marine perimeter on West Beach. And I know who this was fired at, and we'll talk about that now. This is Gary Hall, a young Marine. He's a tall kid who grew up kind of afraid of his own shadow till he joined the Marine Corps. And when he walked back home after a Marine, nobody recognized him. He was big and strong, and he took, he could spit nails at that point. This is Danny Marshall. They called him the orneriest little white boy in the South because he was always in trouble protecting his brothers, and he had a police record. He got in the Marine Corps as a choice between that and jail. When he gets to the theater, he's in bigger trouble because he's been involved in some drug dealings in Okinawa where he was stationed, and he has a chance to walk out the gate there in Thailand before he gets on this island, and he doesn't do it. He sticks with his company, and he winds up part of this same machine gun team. This is Joseph Hargrove. He's the oldest of the bunch. He grew up, and he saved his brothers and sisters one night when his alcoholic father tried to burn down the house with them in it. He woke up and saved them. Now he's on this island with a machine gun team on that flank defending the position. And what happens is that 18 servicemen get left behind on that island when the Marines pull out after they realize there's no crew members on the island. They pull out at night under fire, but they leave all of their dead, they just can't take them out because it's dark and they don't know where they are and this sort of thing. When I walked that island that first day after I got there in 1995, I could figure out what happened to 15 of those missing 18, but there were 3 that didn't add up. I couldn't figure out where they were or who they were. And I asked the captain in charge of the recovery operation while we're sitting in the little mess tent there, I got 15, but there's 3 missing. What's the deal? And he opens up a binder, and he looks at the names. And I lean over to look, and he closes the binder. Excuse me, So I just sit back, and he opens it up again, and he looks for another minute, and then he says, I don't know. Now, how do you go 6,000 miles with a casualty list and tell a journalist you don't know who you're looking for? I mean, it just sends off all kinds of alarm bells. I left that island the first time not knowing what had happened to the 3 mysterious individuals that I couldn't account for. And it turns out they were those 3 individuals. They were the machine gun team defending their buddies at night, and they got left behind alive. And the Marine Corps was a little bit nervous about letting that be known because of traditions. But it gnawed at me. 18, 19 years old, 24-year-olds. And they gave everything, and they're dying in obscurity, and nobody wants to know what they did. It just gnawed at me. So I went back to Cambodia, time and time again, and managed to track down, with the help of the Joint Task Force, some of the Khmer Rouge that were on the island at the time. And there's one of them standing in that slide right now. This is M. San. He's missing a leg, and he has 18 other wounds. This was not a headquarters hack. This was a combat veteran. He was the company commander on the West Beach. And he told me what happened to each of those 3 Marines. And I wrote it in The Last Battle. This book is a tribute to those 3 men, and to the Marine Corps, and the Air Force and the Navy that fought a tremendous battle, and not of their choosing, but those 41 merchant mariners that wound up being released by the Khmer Rouge were very appreciative of what President Ford and those men did for them, because I guarantee you none of them would have survived a Khmer Rouge prison camp, because no other Westerners survived that were captured during that period. So these are some of the things that, that I find when you go on these missions. There's a Marine Corps telephone up there in the far left, some additional Kevlar panels that were found. And below here is the checklist, the co-pilot's checklist on that one helicopter that was shot down. And you can still read the instructions back in '95 when we pulled it out of the water. So it was like the history had stopped. I walked along those beaches and I could find all the machine gun positions that the various individuals had mentioned, and the shell casings were all there. That's where I found the one shell casing that I showed you earlier. No one had cleaned up the battle. So as a historian, it was just an amazing thing to walk through that history and discover all of those things and validate all the things that people were telling me. These 2 expeditions have turned out to launch me on a career, if you will, aircraft archaeology, that kind of thing. And they became, in each case, not only a magazine article, but they went on to become a documentary, which was on NOVA, the PBS channels, on National Geographic International, History Channel, that sort of thing. And after a while, I started getting calls to go out and do these things. And my director in England called me about going to the Solomon Islands in the Pacific to work a story about World War II that involved a Japanese pilot and an American pilot. And I agreed to do it. The Japanese pilot was Saburo Sakai. They're probably the most famous ace. And the Navy pilot was Lieutenant Pug Sutherland. I went to Guadalcanal, which is where they had a dogfight, and we began looking for the aircraft that Pug Sutherland had flown on the opening day of the Guadalcanal campaign. We had to cross this stream, and the reason I show it, it looks pretty nice right now, and it was clear water and up to my knees basically, and pretty easy to cross. And just keep that in mind later on when we talk further. But here's the airplane that Saburo Sakai flew. It's a Japanese Zero. It had a 20mm cannon, and those are mounted on the wings. You can see them sticking out right about here. And it also has 2 machine guns, which are mounted right up in here, 30 caliber machine guns. And the 30 calibers, that's like a rifle bullet. It doesn't really do much. It's the 20mm that does the damage, but they don't have very many rounds on this aircraft, so they prefer to use the 30 caliber and shoot up the target and then come in and finish it off with the 20mm. Pug Sutherland was flying a Wildcat. Now this aircraft, single-engine fighter, but it's heavier than the Zero, doesn't turn as well, but it can outdive the Zero, and it can withstand a tremendous amount of punishment because he's got armor plating behind the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks and a bulletproof windscreen, none of which Saburo Sakai had in his Japanese Zero. Now, they get involved in a dogfight over the island as the Marines are hitting the beach. and Pug Sutherland is attacked by 4 Zeros. They're all using those 30 caliber machine guns, and they're just chewing up his airplane. He's got holes everywhere. He's crunched behind that bulletproof metal behind his seat, and he can hear the bullets pinging off of it. Eventually, the first 3 Zeros give up, and Saburo Sakai comes in, and he attacks, again, shooting the 30 caliber, but to basically no effect. But at one point, he slides past Sutherland. He's got a little bit too much speed. And Sutherland moves to position to shoot at him, but doesn't fire. And then Sakai quickly moves back, shifts the trigger thing on the throttles to the 20 millimeter. But in the process, he's seen the pilot in the cockpit, all bloodied. Sutherland's got a bullet, through his shoulder, one through his foot. Glass fragments have cut him up. And there's that momentary recognition, pilot to pilot, so that when Sakai gets back, he decides not to kill the pilot. At least that's his claim. He decides to shoot at the engine with the 20 millimeter, not the cockpit. And everybody says, well, is that really the case? First thing we do is we go down and we find the records. It's also has to do with a volcano, but this time it's inside a volcano, an old extinct volcano right at the bottom. It was very treacherous getting down in there. But when we get down in there, there's the bureau number, and it's Sutherland's Wildcat. Okay, here's the engine and propeller. It's hard to see, but there's 2 bullet holes right here poking through the prop. And you can see there's a cylinder here. This prop is gone. Remember I started telling you about props. When they hit under power, they usually shear off. That one sheared off. So we know that this engine has been in battle, and we know that it was powered, it had power on it when it hit. This shot is a few minutes after that previous one. You notice how light it was a few minutes before that? Well, it's the same camera, and now it's almost pitch black down there. That's because a huge thunderhead has rolled up over this volcano, and it's getting ready to dump weather. Now, we've struggled to get down into this thing. Now, there's Michael Barnes. He's the director. The look on his face says it all, and the look says, how in the hell are we getting out of here? Because it's now starting to rain, and the raindrops are these huge raindrops, and the mosquitoes are somehow flying around trying to avoid those raindrops. Now, I'd cut my left hand all to bits coming down because of the vines that we had to navigate. And they smell blood like crazy. This left hand, is pulp by that time. He's quite worried about how we're getting out of this place. But then we start to find some things. And here's another 50 caliber. But this one, you'll notice, like before, we can learn some things. Right there is the primer, and nothing has struck the primer. So we know that this round wasn't fired. Okay, here's the same round. You can see a little ding here, and there's a hole right in the round here. This is a bullet from a Japanese machine gun, a 30 caliber bullet. And you notice how this is flared up here? It's sort of opened up a little bit on the right side. Okay, what we know when we look at this is that that round was struck by a 30 caliber Japanese bullet, and it exploded. And when it exploded, the bullet end went off. It was not in a barrel at that time. It was somewhere prior to going into the machine gun. And it caused that machine gun to jam, which is one of the reasons why Pug Sutherland couldn't shoot down Saburo Sakai when he had that opportunity, that momentary opportunity, because one of his guns was jammed. But this is like what I call the Rosetta Stones that we find that start to tell us the story of what's going on at these places. But it wasn't the most important thing as far as I was concerned. Next slide, please. This is Pug's gun. In his account, he mentions that he's got this 45 caliber on his vest, and as he's trying to bail out of this airplane, it gets hung up on part of the canopy bow that's been shattered. And he says, I don't know how I did it, but somehow I got out of that. I got rid of that weapon. And we found the weapon in the wreckage. You know, it's just amazing. Okay, here's a closer shot of the engine. Now you'll see cylinders are missing here, but there's a cylinder right here, and what's really important is the cylinder behind it. And there's part of the cylinder. You see, here's the one that's in good condition, and here's the one behind it. Something has blown it off. And that something was a 20 millimeter round from Subaru Sakai, because the airplane impacted the tree right above where this engine is located, and the only thing that could damage that cylinder, which is on the back row, would be something that hit it from behind. Now, what caused the impact on the 50 caliber I showed you earlier? That was caused when Sutherland attacked a Japanese bomber, and the gunner in the back was firing 30 caliber ammunition at him. It had gone through and jammed one of his guns. Subaru Sakai shoots down Pug Sutherland. Pug Sutherland bails out with all these wounds. Subaru Sakai goes up and attacks a Navy bomber that has a gunner in the back who's firing a 30 caliber machine gun. But because Subaru Sakai's plane has no bulletproof windscreen, one of those rounds comes through the canopy and hits Sakai right above the eye. The bullet penetrates his head, goes through his brain, and exits. And he's out in a zero. And he stays out for some period of time. He wakes up, and a couple of things become apparent to him. The first is that he's in an airplane. Okay? It's like waking up from a sleep, except I'm flying an airplane. And the second thing is he's blind in the right eye, and his whole left side is paralyzed because the right part of the brain has been traumatized. He's 560 miles from Rabaul, and he makes it back. Sutherland is behind Japanese lines, all shot up, in the jungle, all bloodied, and he crawls back, and they both survive. It's one of the greatest stories to come out of World War II. And what was fun was to determine the facts based on what each of them claimed. And I have to tip my hat to Sakai, because I really do believe he aimed for the engine, not the pilot. And that's why Sutherland survived. Sutherland was killed in 1949 testing jets for the Navy. Sakai lived until, I think, 2000. And he's written a lot of, books about his experiences. Okay, now we're getting a little closer to home. This was taken in February of this year. This is in the Philippines. This is the Cogon Tarak Ridge. This is another volcano. It seems like all the wrecks I find have something to do with a volcano. This is Mariveles Volcano on the Bataan Peninsula. And there's three little peaks here that come down. This is the one on the far right where you see this little clearing. That's important because there's a wreck located right about there. Now, back during the fall of the Philippines, a Japanese Nate aircraft and an American P-40 got in a swirling dogfight around this volcano, and there was a lot of clouds there. And they were trading shots. And then both of them disappeared. They heard explosions and whatnot. The P-40, Earl Stone, has a brother who still lives within 5 miles of where we're sitting today, wants to bring his brother home because his brother is still somewhere in that picture that you're looking at. This is that area you saw in the picture where it was light colored and then it starts to get dark. I don't know what the slope is, but it's pretty severe. It's one hand for the ship, one hand for me territory. Okay, that's the Nate that we're looking at. It has 2 machine guns, one here and one on the other side. It's got a little tail skid back here, fixed landing gear, and a cockpit just like the one in the Zero. Okay, here's another engine. This one, the prop housing is pointed up, and if you can see what I'm holding a 30 caliber machine gun. Notice the barrel is bent like a pigtail. Okay, so some of you can be thinking about how that can happen. Okay, here's both machine guns. This is the left-hand machine gun. Notice it's barrel bent. down. As it turns out, this one is bent in the opposite direction if you look at it. And what that tells me is because the machine guns were mounted on either side of the fuselage that the airplane was rolling to the right, bending this one down and this one up. Okay? So now the pilot was in a right-hand roll pulling up. He almost clears that ridge. It's like 87 feet to the top. He almost makes it. But I find the engine, I find the tail skid, and I find this. This is a piece of that canopy. But like I tell you, everything tells you a story. If it was just laying on the ground, then it probably just flew there. But it's not laying on the ground. It's jammed in the ground. And that tells me it was jammed by impact. So now I know where the cockpit hit, if you will. And I tell the tribesmen that are with me, the Aida tribesmen, I said, we're going to dig here. And we start digging by hand. The first thing I found is one of the upper boot things, you know, with all the eyelets. And then I found the other one. And then we found the remains of the Japanese pilot right there where I said. And so we wrapped them all up, and that night I slept in my little one-man tent with Sergeant Sugihara laying beside me, and the Aida tribesmen were outside lighting candles to the gods for disturbing the peace. And we have found his family in Japan. He has a brother and a sister that are still surviving. And that brings us back to this man. This is Gilly Bob Gilchrist, the one I mentioned who went missing on October 7th, 1966. Because you see, Gilly is still out there. He's never come home. And I'm hoping that someday a team will go out in response to some information that's come in, and someone like myself will be there to investigate the wreck and find out what happened to Gilly. And I know his parents, if they're still living, will appreciate it. That fiancé will appreciate it, his brothers and sisters, and so will I. And thank you. That's the end of my discussion.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.